Hello, beautiful community. It's a privilege to have you with me. This is a really late video, so I don't know how many of you will catch it, but you're very welcome here. We're going to talk in a very brief and schematic way, again with the help of a Twitter thread I wrote for us. It's only 6 tweets about this business of what we call this war. Do we call it Putin's war? Do we call it Russia's war, which to some extent implies the Russian people's war? And I don't want to answer that question today, even though I've given answering it a go to an extent in some of the main channel videos. If you're new here, this is the chat channel where we sit about in the living room and chat. There's some more crisp stuff on the main channel. That's how most people get welcomed into this community to begin with, so go over there if you're new. We'll just frame how that conversation begins, if you like. And the stimulus today, I'm not going to overanalyze. The stimulus today is that Tim Snyder went to a restaurant in Vienna, did an interview for the FT, and that interview generated a lot of criticism from academic experts, but above all it generated a conversation about several things that Tim said, and one of them is of course how far this is Putin's war versus the Russian people's war. Maybe I'll say a word about Tim as we go along, but for now we're going to be broad and schematic. So is it Putin's war or is it Russia's war? And I reckon that there are special words we often use, right? One of them is a concern, right? We often talk about how concerns matter more than views. And here I'm going to use the word interest, even though the word concern will probably do too. So what are our different interests when it comes to discussing this question? Our different interests pull us in different directions. Yeah, and everywhere you choose, you lose. Yeah, you can't have it all. So let's look at how that works. So I think there are 3 distinct interests that we bring to this distinction, Putin's war versus Russia's war. The first is ethical. And here we use the distinction to express a degree of ethical culpability. Right? And one of the things we've been very passionate about is to pluralize, widen our spectrum of ethical culpability, because what happens so much in our culture with various kinds of special inheritances in the history of the West, it's that we try to over-elevate the concept of blame, and we tend to think that either somebody is blameworthy, right, or they're bearing no ethical culpability, no ethical responsibility at all. And I want to say we've got to think of this as a rainbow situation. So the first concern we bring to this distinction is ethical. So what's the ethical status of Russian people, right? What about those who positively support the war? What about the depoliticized blob in the middle? What about those who vehemently oppose the war? Right? The second interest we bring is political. And the thing that really matters about politics is politics. Too often we talk as though we're talking about politics, but in fact we're just making moral claims. And it's very, very important to get clear about what it means to speak with a political interest, right? So here we use the distinction to politicize the Russian space, probably above all. And the third approach is really important because it goes to the heart of a central institution in a democracy, which is the institution of expertise, typically expressed in the academy, right? And what I believe, and you know that, is that the academy, right, functional universities that are flourishing rather than dying off, that sustain free speech adequately and give people a possibility to engage in the ritual of a liberal education and so on, blah, blah, blah. But these institutions are important. They produce experts, and these experts are themselves an institution as important as the courts, as important as the parliaments, as important as a non-muzzled media to the sustenance of democracy. So the third interest we bring to this distinction, Putin's war, Russia's war, is the interpretive interest, where we're trying to go about explaining what's going on. So we use the distinction to help us figure out what's going on in Russia. So first, a little bit of moral philosophy. Anybody who has been with me for a long time has probably watched my little video essay on the difference between blame and responsibility, right? And that's a video about the responsibility of all Russians for the war that starts with a discussion of a couple of pieces by Thomas Mann, including his famous piece, Brother Hitler, that go right to the heart of this conversation about degrees of ethical culpability, right? And so when it comes to ethics, I just want to leave you with that bit of political philosophy on which I expand in that video. I might as well link that video up at the end, actually, for those who haven't seen it. All Russians are responsible for Putin's war, but only a minority of Russians are guilty, right? And that's because, as Thomas Mann showed in Brother Hitler, there is such a thing as responsibility by association, right? So if my sister, I have a younger sister, she's 8 years less than me, she left the Soviet Union when she was 1. Actually, I was 9, she was 1. So she's completely British. And if my sister robs a bank in a way that I can't control at all, I know nothing about it, it's a surprise, we live in different countries, I can't control what she does, she lives in Portugal, what can I do? I can't stop her, but I'm responsible by this business of, responsibility by association. I'll feel ethically implicated a bit if my sister robs a bank. So there is no such thing as responsibility by association, but there is such a thing as responsibility by association, but there is no such thing as guilt by association. Right. Now we get to the political usage. And the political usage is not just a distinction about Russian politics, it's itself a political distinction. You get the difference, right? It's not an observation about politics, it's itself a political act, right? And actually with most political concepts, it's much more obvious than it is with this business of this distinction, that they are themselves political acts, right? And they serve political purposes, right? And the construction of a political concept in the modern world is got to be responsive to the political conditions of the modern world. It can't just be a theoretical construction nicely done in an ivory tower. So it is there to serve political purposes. And one good example of a political purpose is what we in the West might, how we might in the West use that distinction to clarify and encourage what we want to see happen in the Russian space. There's something we're very blurry about. And that's actually central to a conversation about how far we back Ukraine. How far we back Ukraine is partly a product of our capacity in the first instance to even envision what we want ideally to happen on the Russian space, and then second to try to take steps to bring it about. Third, interpretive usage. And here we aspire to put the distinction to good explanatory use. when a problem arises. And that's isn't explanatory usage itself a political choice? Won't the analyses and images we conjure shape our political imagination, right? So, for example, if we over-egg it on this business of here the Russians go again, that's what they always do, we're going to abstract our capacity to reimagine the Russian space and push within the degree of influence that we have for stuff to happen on that space that serves our interests. There's another, related danger here, more explicit danger that Greg Uden often talks about, which is the kind of Levada center problem, which just generates these polls that show 70% of support for Putin. The Levadification of our perception of Russia. And if we are sufficiently uncritical, we're just going to take this stuff as though it implies that there is positive and substantive support for the war among the Russian population, but no single expert thinks that's true, right? There is a danger there, because that's going to affect how we interact with our public discourse, our politics toward what happens on the Russian space. Rather than making plenty of distinctions about this, especially because this is late, I'd love to recommend Jade McGlynn's book, which is really two books. There's Memory Makers and there's Russia's War. But let me recommend Russia's War here because that speaks directly to the topic that we discussed. What I like about Jade's work as an expert of the younger generation is that she's very trustworthy in the way she responds to what she is investigating and what she's making sense of. That's to say, there's a wonderful proportionality to her response, and proportionality doesn't mean distance or coldness. It rather means a healthy blend of closeness and distance. And what does that mean again? It means that we are assessing experts procedurally. We're not assessing experts on the basis how many ticks we give them. They have these 17 views. If we agree with all 17, we give them a tick. That's not how it works. You've really got to have a perspective on the experts you follow that is much more procedural than just do I disagree or do I agree with them, you know? I mean, I'm just to make a private point, in the world of philosophy, I'm in a position of just feeling love and warmth for books and projects that contain things that I don't agree with. But I think they're wonderful books and projects. Enough for now. Lots of love. Talk very soon. Maybe there's going to be a live tomorrow evening UK time. Come along, ask a question. Bye for now.